England, 1845. In a kingdom where a gentleman's name could open every door and a lady's reputation could close every one forever, there wandered a young woman whom England had already condemned without a trial. Her name traveled faster than she did, carried from manor to manor by whispers that grew darker with every mile. Servants lowered their voices when they spoke of her. Noble women tightened their shawls as though misfortune itself lingered in the air around her. Newspapers never accused her directly, yet every careful sentence pointed toward the same shadow, calling her the woman whose presence foretold ruin. Few could explain what she had done. Fewer still cared to ask. Miss Eliza Fairmont walked another lonely road beneath a sky heavy with rain, her worn leather traveling bag resting against her shoulder like the last companion she had left. At 25, she possessed the quiet beauty of someone who had forgotten to think about beauty altogether. Dark chestnut hair escaped the neat knot at her neck after endless days on the road, while pale gray eyes carried both gentleness and exhaustion. Her modest brown traveling dress had been carefully mended so many times that the stitches themselves seemed to tell the story of every rejection she had endured. Though fatigue bent her shoulders, dignity still guided every step she took. Inside the leather bag rested the whole of her remaining life. A weathered Bible with her mother's name written inside its cover. A faded portrait wrapped carefully in linen. Several letters tied together with an old blue ribbon that had long since lost its color. A tiny silver key whose lock no longer existed in any house she knew. At the very bottom lay a sealed envelope she had never found the courage to open. She carried it because she had promised she always would, though she feared its contents more than the uncertainty of tomorrow. The village of Ashfield appeared through the morning mist just as church bells echoed across the fields. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys, and children laughed while chasing one another through puddles left by the night's rain. For one hopeful moment, the ordinary sounds of life almost convinced Eliza that perhaps this village had never heard her name. She straightened her cloak, smoothed her dress, and approached the largest house near the square, where a respectable widow was said to be searching for a lady's companion. The housekeeper opened the polished oak door only a few inches before studying Eliza's face with polite curiosity. Hope flickered between them until Eliza quietly introduced herself. Recognition struck like winter frost. Without another word, the woman's expression hardened, and the door closed gently but firmly between them. No anger. No explanation. Simply another silent refusal. Before Eliza had reached the garden gate, she heard muffled voices behind the curtains. Thank heaven we asked her name. They say 3 noble families fell after she entered their homes. Don't let the children near her. The words followed her long after the house disappeared behind ancient hedges. By afternoon, rain began falling with relentless determination, soaking the narrow country roads until every step became heavier than the last. Eliza continued walking without complaint, though water seeped through the cracked soles of her boots and chilled her feet with every mile. Hunger gnawed quietly inside her, yet she ignored it as she always had. She had learned years ago that dignity survived longest when it was fed before pride. Near an old stone bridge, she noticed 2 young brothers crouching beneath a broken cart, their threadbare coats offering little protection from the rain. They stared longingly toward the loaf of bread tucked inside her satchel. Without hesitation, she divided the loaf into 3 uneven pieces, ensuring the boys received the larger portions before taking only a small crust for herself. They thanked her with cautious smiles before running toward the shelter of distant cottages, never asking her name. She silently hoped they never would. Evening settled across the countryside beneath dark clouds that swallowed the last traces of sunlight. Eliza discovered the abandoned remains of a small chapel standing among twisted oak trees. Moss covered the cracked stones and shattered stained glass glittered faintly beneath pools of rainwater. The roof leaked in countless places, yet one dry corner remained beside the old altar. She spread her worn blanket upon the cold floor and prepared to rest. A faint sob interrupted the silence. Near the doorway huddled a little orphan girl no older than 8, shivering violently beneath soaked clothes far thinner than Eliza's own. The child tried to hide, frightened by every stranger she met. Eliza smiled gently without speaking, removed her blanket, and wrapped it around the trembling girl before settling herself against the freezing stone wall instead. Throughout the long night, she listened to the rain striking broken windows while cold slowly crept into her bones. She never once regretted the choice. Before dawn, she awoke to discover the child gone. In the blanket's place rested a single white wildflower, still damp with morning dew. Eliza tucked it carefully inside her Bible, allowing herself the smallest smile she had worn in many weeks. Days blended into one another until roads, villages, and disappointments became almost impossible to distinguish. Each estate repeated the same quiet ritual. A hopeful knock, a cautious greeting, recognition, then another closed door. Once, an elderly gardener secretly pointed toward a stone wall outside the village before disappearing without explanation. Curious, Eliza found a fresh loaf of bread resting exactly where he had indicated. No note accompanied it. No face claimed the kindness. She whispered her thanks into the empty morning air before continuing onward. As summer faded toward autumn, the distant towers of Ashcombe Palace finally rose above ancient forests like something carved from another age. Its towering walls overlooked the surrounding countryside with silent authority, while black iron gates guarded one of England's wealthiest estates. Eliza paused at the foot of the long drive, drawing a slow breath before approaching the entrance. The elderly butler opened the gates only long enough to see her face. Recognition flashed through his eyes, followed by unmistakable alarm. He immediately ordered the gates shut. Heavy iron groaned as they began to close, but before they met, a magnificent black carriage rolled silently through the rain. A tall, clean-shaven gentleman stepped onto the glistening stones, his expression unreadable. Duke Tristan Ashcombe looked at Eliza only once before speaking in a calm voice that silenced every servant nearby. "Open the gates," he said. Then, after one measured pause, he added words that left the entire estate frozen in disbelief. "She's mine now." The enormous gates swung inward with a slow groan, yet the silence that followed felt heavier than iron. Every servant standing along the entrance court stared at Eliza as though an invisible storm had crossed the threshold with her. She lowered her eyes, clutching the worn leather bag against her side, uncertain whether she had been rescued or sentenced. Duke Tristan Ashcombe offered neither explanation nor reassurance. He merely turned toward the palace and walked inside with measured steps, expecting everyone else to follow. The butler hesitated before obeying. Years of faithful service urged him to trust his master, but years of rumor whispered something different. He finally bowed and invited Eliza across the polished marble floor. The warmth of the grand entrance hall wrapped around her chilled body, carrying the comforting scent of beeswax, burning oak, and fresh flowers. Crystal chandeliers glimmered above portraits of stern ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to judge every stranger entering their home. Whispers spread faster than footsteps. "The Duke has lost his senses. Does he truly know who she is? They say every household she enters collapses." No one spoke loudly enough for Tristan to hear, yet every word reached Eliza with painful clarity. She neither protested nor defended herself. She simply stood quietly while rainwater dripped from the hem of her cloak onto the polished floor. Mrs. Gresham, the elderly housekeeper, approached with cautious dignity. Unlike the others, she studied Eliza carefully before speaking. "His Grace has instructed that you are to assist throughout the household until permanent duties are decided. You will be given a room in the servants' wing." Her tone remained professional, though uncertainty lingered behind every syllable. Eliza bowed gratefully. "Thank you." It was all she said. Several servants exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected excuses, tears, perhaps anger. Instead, they found only quiet gratitude. High above them, from the gallery overlooking the hall, a graceful woman watched unseen. Lady Rowena Blackwell rested one gloved hand upon the carved railing, her emerald gown shimmering beneath the chandelier's light. At 33, she possessed striking beauty sharpened by flawless composure. She had expected to become the future Duchess of Ashcombe. Seeing another woman welcomed into the palace, particularly this woman, disturbed her far more than she allowed anyone to notice. Her elegant smile never faltered. Neither did the calculation behind it. That evening, while servants gathered below stairs for supper, conversation revolved entirely around Eliza. Some claimed she had bankrupted earls. Others insisted she carried an ancient curse. A young kitchen maid confessed she had never heard a single true story about her, only fragments repeated endlessly. Before anyone could answer, Lady Rowena entered the servants' hall with effortless grace, pretending she had merely taken a wrong corridor. "I knew Miss Fairmont years ago," she said softly. Every conversation stopped. "It always begins quietly. She seems kind. Then sorrow follows." She sighed with convincing sadness. "I only hope Ashcombe survives what other families could not." When she departed, fear settled over the room like fresh snowfall. Eliza remained unaware of the conversation. Mrs. Gresham had assigned her the smallest chamber beneath the eastern roof, where a narrow bed overlooked the neglected palace greenhouse. Though modest, the room was clean, warm, and infinitely kinder than abandoned chapels or lonely roads. She unpacked only her Bible and carefully placed the faded wildflower between its pages before kneeling beside the bed in silent prayer. The following morning she reported for work before sunrise. She polished silver, folded linens, carried water, never complained, never rested until everyone else had finished. Late that night, after the household slept, she noticed several young footmen quietly repairing torn uniforms by candlelight because replacements were too costly. Without announcing herself, Eliza gathered the damaged garments and began stitching them with remarkable skill. Her needle moved swiftly through worn fabric, reinforcing weak seams until each coat looked almost new. Before dawn she placed every finished uniform neatly outside their doors without leaving her name. The footmen never discovered who had helped them. Children employed in the servants' wing soon discovered her kindness by accident. Whenever chores ended early, Eliza read old adventure stories from forgotten library books, giving every character a different voice until frightened faces dissolved into laughter. For one precious hour each evening, exhaustion gave way to imagination. Even the strict laundress smiled from the doorway while pretending not to listen. Across the gardens, the palace greenhouse stood abandoned after years of neglect. Dust-coated broken shelves, dead vines clung stubbornly to cracked walls, and forgotten flowerbeds had surrendered to weeds. Whenever her duties allowed, Eliza quietly worked there alone. She trimmed dying branches, replanted bulbs, washed soot-blackened glass, and whispered gentle encouragement to fragile seedlings as though hope itself could bloom if someone remained patient enough. One rainy afternoon, stable hands struggled with an aging gray horse whose injured leg had left him unable to pull carriages. The steward declared the animal useless and ordered preparations for its destruction. Before anyone could lead the trembling creature away, Eliza stepped forward. She asked only for 3 weeks. Reluctantly, the steward agreed, convinced failure would prove the rumors correct. Every morning before sunrise she cleaned the wound, changed fresh bandages, mixed herbal poultices remembered from caring for the late countess, and fed the frightened horse by hand. Slowly the animal began trusting her. By the 2nd week he nickered softly whenever she appeared. By the 3rd he stood without trembling. The palace dogs noticed first. Instead of avoiding the stranger everyone feared, they followed Eliza through gardens and corridors with quiet devotion, wagging their tails whenever she passed. Servants laughed nervously, unable to explain why creatures known for sensing danger sought her company so eagerly. Duke Tristan noticed everything. He never interrupted her work, never praised her, never questioned the rumors. From distant windows, library balconies, and stable doors he simply observed. He watched how servants unconsciously relaxed whenever she entered a room. He saw children smile more easily. He noticed flowers returning to life inside the greenhouse. Most importantly, he saw that every act of kindness occurred when she believed nobody was watching. Then came the storm. Thunder shattered the evening sky while violent winds bent ancient oaks nearly to the ground. Rain lashed against the greenhouse just as 2 servant children slipped inside searching for a frightened kitten. A blinding bolt of lightning struck the glass roof, igniting dry wooden beams in an explosion of sparks. Flames raced upward with terrifying speed. Panicked cries echoed across the gardens as servants rushed toward the blaze. Eliza reached the burning doorway first. Without hesitation she disappeared into the smoke. Moments later she emerged carrying both children, coughing violently as burning timbers crashed behind her. Relief lasted only seconds before someone shouted that disaster had followed her again. While frightened whispers spread through the gathering crowd, Duke Tristan stared not at the fire, but at the twisted iron doors. Their heavy lock had been fastened from the outside before lightning ever struck. Dawn arrived beneath a sky the color of weathered steel, yet Ashcombe Palace awakened with unusual unease. Smoke still drifted from the blackened skeleton of the greenhouse, and servants crossed the gardens speaking in whispers whenever Eliza passed. Although she had carried 2 terrified children out of the flames, suspicion clung to her more stubbornly than gratitude. She returned quietly to her duties with bandaged hands, accepting every fearful glance without resentment. Duke Tristan watched from the library window until she disappeared beyond the stables, then summoned his most trusted secretary and issued only one instruction: reopen everything connected to Miss Fairmont. The command surprised even the loyal secretary. 7-year-old court files had long been sealed, witnesses had scattered across England, and memories had faded beneath newer scandals. Nevertheless, the Duke's authority admitted no debate. Before noon, discreet letters rode toward distant counties requesting forgotten parish records, estate ledgers, and magistrates' reports. Tristan wanted evidence, not gossip. If England had condemned an innocent woman, He intended to discover precisely who had profited. Days passed while Eliza continued transforming the palace through unnoticed kindness. The gray horse steadily regained strength beneath her patient care, flowers reopened inside repaired corners of the greenhouse, and frightened servants slowly accepted that misfortune did not follow wherever she walked. Yet whenever anyone thanked her, she gently redirected the conversation. She accepted neither praise nor sympathy. It seemed she believed she deserved neither. One evening Mrs. Gresham approached her carrying fresh linen. "You never explain yourself," the housekeeper observed quietly. Eliza folded a towel before answering. "Some promises are heavier than truth." Mrs. Gresham searched her face. "Who made you promise?" Eliza's fingers paused only briefly. "Someone worth protecting." She spoke no more. Those few words lingered in the housekeeper's thoughts long after she departed. Meanwhile, Tristan traveled without public announcement, wearing an ordinary riding coat instead of ducal finery. He visited the estates most closely linked to Eliza's disgrace. At Whitby Manor he found abandoned rooms preserved exactly as they had appeared when the elderly Countess Eleanor died. Dust covered elegant furniture, but hidden beneath a writing desk lay an overlooked ledger. Every page praised Eliza's honesty, intelligence, and unwavering devotion. The final entry ended abruptly 3 days before the Countess's death. There was no accusation, only gratitude. At the second estate, servants reluctantly admitted they had never witnessed Eliza harming anyone. They had merely repeated newspaper stories because respectable people believed them. An elderly gardener confessed he had once seen her secretly paying a tenant family's overdue rent from her own savings, then begging them never to reveal her generosity. Another former governess remembered Eliza comforting children during a terrible legal dispute while their parents shouted behind locked doors. Everywhere Tristan searched, acts of quiet compassion replaced every rumor of cruelty. The pattern disturbed him profoundly. Every household associated with Eliza had indeed survived catastrophe. Every catastrophe had vanished almost overnight. And somehow each miracle coincided with the beginning of her disgrace. Returning to London, Tristan obtained permission to inspect forgotten government archives scheduled for demolition. Candlelight flickered across endless shelves crowded with neglected documents tied in faded ribbon. Dust filled the silent chambers, coating his gloves as he searched through forgotten investigations abandoned by ambitious officials years before. Hours yielded nothing except contradictions until one cracked leather portfolio slipped from a broken cabinet and burst open across the stone floor. Inside rested correspondence never presented in court. Several letters described forged testimony. Others recorded unexplained payments to witnesses. One unsigned memorandum mentioned a private meeting attended by Lady Rowena Blackwell and Lord Benedict Harrow shortly before scandal consumed Eliza's name. Tristan's expression hardened. He continued reading. At the very bottom lay a folded confession written in graceful handwriting he immediately recognized from labels inside Ashcombe's restored greenhouse. Eliza's. His pulse slowed. The confession declared responsibility for financial deception, document theft, and obstruction of justice. Yet the details contradicted every verified fact uncovered during his investigation. Dates failed to align. Locations proved impossible. More astonishing still, scattered notes attached to the confession revealed marginal comments from an unknown investigator questioning its authenticity before the file mysteriously disappeared. Tristan unfolded one final page hidden beneath the others. It was never intended for any courtroom. Addressed simply to whoever finds this, the unfinished letter explained everything. Eliza admitted she was innocent. She accepted blame because exposing the true conspirators would have imprisoned 3 fathers simultaneously, leaving 7 innocent children destitute and vulnerable to the workhouse. Lord Benedict had manipulated legal evidence, while influential families feared public disgrace more than justice. Someone needed a willing scapegoat before dawn. Eliza offered herself after extracting one promise. The children would never learn why their families survived. She surrendered her inheritance, future, friendships, and good name so they could keep their parents. Every signature beneath the false confession had been obtained through coercion disguised as mercy. Tristan lowered the pages with trembling hands. The silent archive seemed suddenly filled with voices that history had refused to hear. England had not rejected a criminal. It had exiled a woman who had willingly buried herself beneath disgrace to preserve innocent lives. Every cold glance she endured, every locked door she faced, every lonely mile she walked had been purchased by a sacrifice nobody honored because nobody knew. He closed his eyes, whispering words that echoed softly through the deserted chamber. Dear God. Outside church bells tolled the evening hour as rain tapped the ancient windows. Tristan understood that exposing the conspiracy would challenge England's proudest families, perhaps even Parliament itself. Still, silence had already stolen 7 years from Eliza, and enough was enough. When he opened them again, resolve had replaced shock. He carefully gathered every document, every hidden letter, every forgotten record into the leather portfolio. As he secured the final ribbon, another sealed envelope slipped from its lining. Across its front, written in Lord Benedict Harrow's unmistakable hand, appeared 7 chilling words: "Destroy these before the engagement celebration at Ashcombe." Even before sunset, elegant carriages rolled through the towering gates of Ashcombe Palace one after another, their polished lanterns glowing beneath a sky washed silver by lingering rain. England's most influential nobles had accepted Lady Rowena Blackwell's invitation to an evening she proudly described as the beginning of Ashcombe's glorious future. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the magnificent ballroom while musicians filled the air with graceful waltzes. Servants carried silver trays through laughing circles of aristocrats, yet beneath every pleasant smile lay restless curiosity. Rumors had spread that Duke Tristan intended to announce his engagement before the night ended. Lady Rowena welcomed every guest with flawless elegance. Emerald silk shimmered around her graceful figure, and diamonds sparkled at her throat whenever she turned her head. She carried herself with effortless confidence, convinced that years of careful manipulation had finally delivered everything she desired. From across the ballroom, she noticed Eliza quietly arranging flowers beside the marble staircase, having volunteered to assist the servants rather than remain hidden upstairs. Even dressed simply in a pale gray gown borrowed from Mrs. Gresham, Eliza possessed a quiet dignity impossible to imitate. Rowena approached with practiced warmth. "I am surprised you accepted staying here after everything England believes about you," she said softly enough that only nearby ladies could hear. Eliza lowered her eyes. "His Grace offered kindness. I could not refuse it." Several noblewomen exchanged skeptical glances. Rowena smiled gently. "Kindness often has unfortunate consequences." Without another word, she drifted away, leaving the poisonous suggestion behind like invisible perfume. Throughout the evening, conversations repeatedly returned to Eliza. Some guests stared openly. Others whispered behind jeweled fans. A few fathers quietly moved their daughters elsewhere whenever she approached. Eliza endured every glance with calm composure, helping elderly guests find their seats, comforting frightened servant children overwhelmed by the crowd, and thanking every maid who offered assistance. She neither defended herself nor fled from humiliation. Her silence possessed more grace than many speeches. High above the ballroom, Duke Tristan watched everything from the gallery outside his private study. Beside him rested the old leather portfolio recovered from London's forgotten archives. Inside lay 7 years of buried truth. Mrs. Gresham entered quietly. "They're waiting for your announcement, Your Grace." "They shall have one." His answer carried neither excitement nor hesitation. He descended the staircase exactly as the orchestra completed its final piece. The ballroom fell silent. Many assumed he would cross directly toward Lady Rowena. Instead, he stopped at the center of the room beside a long oak table. Without speaking, he placed the worn leather portfolio upon its polished surface. Confusion rippled through the gathering. Rowena's smile faltered. Tristan finally broke the silence. "Tonight," he said evenly, "England will hear something rarer than rumor." His steady gaze moved across the assembled nobility. "It will hear the truth." He untied the faded ribbon surrounding the documents. The first record described forged financial evidence introduced against Eliza 7 years earlier. The second exposed payments secretly delivered to false witnesses. The third contained parish records proving she had been miles away whenever one alleged crime supposedly occurred. Murmurs spread through the ballroom. Faces slowly paled. Then Tristan invited 3 unexpected guests forward. An elderly gardener. A retired governess. A former court clerk. One after another, each testified under solemn oath. The gardener described Eliza sacrificing her inheritance to feed struggling tenant families. The governess recounted watching Eliza comfort frightened children while powerful adults bargained over reputations instead of justice. The clerk admitted receiving direct instructions from Lord Benedict Harrow to seal contradictory evidence before official hearings began. Shock replaced disbelief. Several nobles exchanged horrified looks. Others quietly sat down, unable to remain standing. Lord Benedict suddenly pushed through the crowd. "This is absurd," he declared sharply. "These accusations rely upon forgotten papers and frightened old servants." Tristan calmly lifted the final confession. It also relies upon your handwriting. He revealed the sealed envelope bearing Benedict's unmistakable instructions ordering every remaining document destroyed before the celebration. Gasps echoed beneath the chandeliers. Benedict lunged toward the portfolio. Before he reached it, two magistrates stepped from the rear of the ballroom, accompanied by uniformed officers carrying signed warrants prepared earlier that afternoon. Without resistance, Lord Benedict realized his game had ended. As he was escorted away, his silence confessed more completely than any argument ever could. All eyes turned toward Lady Rowena. For the first time that evening, confidence deserted her. Tears gathered unexpectedly. "I never intended this to become so terrible," she whispered. "You preserved the lie," Tristan replied quietly. She lowered her head. "I feared losing everything." Across the ballroom, Eliza closed her eyes. She understood fear. She had lived beside it for 7 endless years. Instead of condemning Rowena, she walked forward until only a few steps separated them. "I forgive you," she said gently. The words struck harder than accusation. Rowena covered her face and quietly wept. One elderly earl approached next. Then another. Soon men and women who had once refused Eliza shelter stood before her with trembling voices and lowered heads. "We believed lies. We abandoned you. Can forgiveness truly exist after this?" Eliza answered each apology with the same quiet compassion. "If bitterness had become my home, I would have lost far more than my reputation." Many guests openly cried. Even hardened servants wiped tears from their eyes. Mrs. Gresham silently reached for Eliza's hand. The frightened children she had rescued from the greenhouse wrapped their arms around her waist. For the first time in years she no longer stood alone. The burden she had carried across England seemed lighter than the worn leather bag resting quietly near the ballroom entrance. Believing every hidden truth had finally been revealed, Eliza stepped away from the gathering. She thanked Mrs. Gresham, smiled gently at the servant children, and walked toward the great doors, intending to leave the celebration before anyone attempted to honor her. She had never sought admiration, only peace. Her fingers closed around the familiar handle of the weathered travel bag that had accompanied every lonely mile since disgrace became her only companion. Before she could lift it, another hand rested softly upon the leather. She looked up into Duke Tristan's steady eyes. Without speaking, he took the bag from her grasp, placed it carefully beside his polished boots, and then, before England's astonished nobility, slowly removed his gloves and began to lower himself onto one knee. Duke Tristan Ashcombe lowered himself onto one knee with the same calm certainty that had silenced England only moments before. The magnificent ballroom seemed to forget how to breathe. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, casting warm light across hundreds of astonished faces, yet his attention never left Eliza. She stood frozen before him, unable to comprehend what was happening. For 7 years she had imagined countless endings to her sorrow, but none had ever resembled this impossible moment. The worn leather traveling bag rested between them. Tristan gently placed one gloved hand upon it. "This," he said quietly, "is the heaviest burden in this room." His voice carried across the ballroom without effort. "It holds more than possessions." He looked into Eliza's tear-filled eyes. "It holds every door that was closed, every rejection, every lonely road, every night beneath broken roofs, every silent accusation, every mile she had walked with no one beside her." The Duke slowly lifted the bag from the polished floor. "You carried your entire life alone." His fingers tightened gently around the worn leather handle polished smooth by years of faithful use. "No woman should ever have to do that." His voice softened further. "Least of all you." Tears slipped silently down Eliza's cheeks. She tried to speak. No words came. For the first time since entering Ashcombe Palace, Duke Tristan smiled. It was not a grand smile, nor dramatic, only small, gentle, entirely genuine. It transformed the stern man England feared into someone infinitely warmer than anyone had imagined. He reached inside his coat and removed a simple velvet box. "I cannot return the years they stole from you." He paused. "I cannot erase the roads you walked." Another pause. "I cannot make England worthy of your forgiveness." He opened the box. Inside rested the Ashcombe family ring, its sapphire catching the candlelight like a piece of the evening sky. "But I can promise you something greater." He stood slowly, taking one careful step closer. "I promise that from this day forward, you will never stand alone." He extended the ring toward her. "Miss Eliza Fairmont." His steady voice grew unexpectedly tender. Will you allow me the privilege of spending the rest of my life making this estate the home that should have welcomed you 7 years ago? Silence answered him. Not uncertain silence. Overwhelmed silence. Eliza looked down at the ring before raising her eyes toward the countless faces surrounding them. Only hours earlier those same people had believed she carried ruin. Now many openly wept. She looked back at Tristan. I own nothing. You own courage, he answered immediately. My reputation. I know your reputation. My future. He smiled again. I am asking to become part of it. She laughed softly through tears. It was the first carefree laugh she had allowed herself in years. Then, with trembling fingers, she accepted the ring. Yes. The single word echoed through the ballroom more powerfully than any royal proclamation. Applause did not erupt immediately. Many guests remained too moved to react. Then Mrs. Gresham began clapping. The elderly gardener followed. The servant children. The footmen whose uniforms Eliza had secretly repaired. The stable hands. Soon every servant in Ashcombe Palace stood applauding before the nobility joined them. For the first time that evening, rank disappeared. Only gratitude remained. Several weeks later, autumn sunlight bathed Ashcombe Palace in soft gold as preparations transformed the estate for a wedding unlike any England had ever witnessed. Tristan rejected London's Grand Cathedral. Instead, he chose the palace gardens. It was here, he explained quietly, that hope began growing again. Thousands of white roses surrounded a simple stone aisle leading beneath an ancient oak tree whose branches stretched protectively across the gathering. The restored greenhouse sparkled nearby, now overflowing with flowers rescued through Eliza's patient hands. The once injured gray horse stood proudly at the head of the wedding carriage, his silver harness gleaming in the morning light. Stable boys smiled every time they looked at him. He had become living proof that kindness often succeeded where convenience surrendered. Eliza walked toward the waiting Duke wearing an elegant ivory Victorian gown embroidered with delicate white roses instead of jewels. She insisted upon simplicity, believing beauty should never overshadow sincerity. Mrs. Gresham fastened the veil herself, her weathered hands trembling with maternal pride. You arrived carrying only one bag, the old housekeeper whispered. Eliza smiled. I leave carrying a family. As she stepped into the gardens, every servant lined the aisle beside England's highest nobility. Not behind them. Beside them. Tristan had ordered it personally. Those who stood beside us in hardship, he declared, shall stand beside us in joy. No one objected. When Eliza reached him, neither noticed the guests. Only each other. The ceremony remained beautifully brief. There were no extravagant speeches. No displays of wealth. Only promises spoken with absolute sincerity. When they exchanged vows, Tristan quietly added words never written in the official ceremony. If ever another soul stands where you once stood, our home will become theirs before nightfall. Eliza squeezed his hand. I make you the same promise. The bells of Ashcombe rang across the countryside. Their carriage departed beneath showers of white rose petals, drawn proudly by the old gray horse everyone once believed useless. Months passed. Winter settled gently across England. Snow blanketed the palace grounds, softening every stone wall and ancient tree. Yet Ashcombe Palace no longer resembled the isolated fortress Eliza had first approached. The great eastern wing had been transformed into something entirely new. Ashcombe House. Its doors welcomed abandoned women, widows, dismissed governesses, young mothers, orphan girls, women whose names society had discarded. Every bedroom contained fresh blankets, warm fires, clean clothing, fresh bread, libraries, classrooms, gardens. No one was questioned before receiving shelter. No one was judged before receiving kindness. Mrs. Gresham supervised the household with joyful authority. The elderly gardener tended orchards with children laughing around him. The servant who had once secretly left bread upon a lonely stone wall became head steward after Tristan quietly discovered his anonymous compassion. When thanked for the promotion, the man simply bowed. I only offered one loaf. Tristan smiled. It was enough. Ashcombe soon became famous throughout England, though not because of its wealth. People spoke instead of its open gates. Travelers claimed hope lived there. Widows called it sanctuary. Children called it home. Even newspapers that once repeated cruel rumors now published stories celebrating the Duchess whose forgiveness had transformed an entire county. Yet Eliza never allowed praise to change her. Each morning she still visited the kitchens. Still read stories to servant children. Still tended flowers in the greenhouse. Still carried bread in her pockets whenever she walked through the village. Tristan often found her there, sleeves rolled neatly above her wrists, laughing with gardeners or kneeling beside frightened newcomers. "You never stopped being the woman I met outside those gates," he said one evening. She slipped her hand into his. "Because she finally found somewhere she belonged." He kissed her forehead gently. "You were always meant to belong here." Late one snowy afternoon, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and silver, the palace bell rang unexpectedly. A lone figure stood beyond the great gates. She appeared scarcely older than 19. Her cloak was soaked from melting snow. A weathered leather traveling bag hung from one exhausted shoulder. Fear clouded her eyes. When the gatekeeper approached, the young woman lowered her head. "I understand if you refuse me," she whispered. No respectable home in England would open its door. Before anyone else could answer, Duchess Eliza stepped onto the snowy path. She recognized the weight that bent the stranger's shoulders. She recognized the hopelessness hidden behind exhausted eyes. Without hesitation, she crossed the final distance herself. She reached for the young woman's trembling hand. Then she gently took the worn leather bag from her shoulder, just as Tristan had once taken hers. A warm smile illuminated her face. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." She opened the great gates with her own hands. "Come inside." The frightened young woman burst into tears. Together they walked toward the palace, where golden light spilled from every window into the winter evening. Behind them, the great gates of Ashcombe closed slowly, not to shut the world out, but to shelter everyone who had once believed they had nowhere left to belong. And in that house, where compassion had become stronger than rumor and truth had finally outlived fear, every lost soul who crossed its threshold discovered the same miracle Eliza Fairmont had found on a rainy afternoon long ago. They had not arrived at the end of their journey. They had finally come home.